Grace and peace of God our Father and our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. I'm going to ask you to take a view of perhaps an eagle high in the sky looking down and seeing there what is portrayed in the book of Ruth. There are three women that are gathered together in this country of Moab. Moab, which you perhaps will know, is right next, it's east of Judah, of Israel. And you also perhaps know that the Moabites were descendants of Lot. And so there was a relationship, since Lot was the nephew of Abraham, there was a relationship that went back hundreds of years. But the Moabites were not followers of Jehovah. And so it was a rather bold move that had taken Elimelech, the father, to take his family, the two sons and his wife Naomi, take them into this country because there was no food for them. Something had gone wrong as far as his land was concerned. So there was an emergency, and it was enough of an emergency that he went to find a place where he could provide for his family. And so here on Labor Day, or at least Labor Day weekend, when we thank God for the gifts that he has given us, the ability to work and the ability to work in this land, which is so incredible as far as the freedoms that we have. We now look at this man who wanted to make a good thing happen, but yet what happened was that he died. And during that time, his sons had married Orpah and Ruth, and they died. And so what was the situation as we look down and we see these women talking? What was the situation for them? How could they possibly do the right thing, survive? How could they move ahead? And Naomi was very upset, very bitter, but she certainly had a reason to be upset because for her legacy had ended. Since she had no grandchildren, and since her two sons had died, that was it. And in that particular culture, it was even more dramatic than in our culture. In that particular culture, it meant that there was also no easier way for her to be provided for. She had nobody to look out for her. She was a widow with two widowed daughters. Now I want you to go fast forward in our little narrative clip. Go fast forward, and you're back in Judah. You're very close to Bethlehem Ephratah. It's the same place as most people think, but it's called by two different names. Bethlehem Ephratah. And so they're back home, and now we are seeing a field, a harvest time. And perhaps it was in early May, and the barley was now ripe. And the reapers were out in the field with their scythes, and they were cutting away at the barley. And women, and perhaps men, but women were coming along and bundling these, putting them into sheaths and stacking them. And amongst them, and I don't know the number, I like to think that it was a little bit larger than perhaps we would because you needed a lot of hands in the field, so maybe, 20, 25, 30. But amongst them, there was one woman that was new. And so when the owner of the land, as we had in our children's message, when the owner of our land came, that was Boaz, he said, "Who is that young lady?" And then he also had an anticipation. He knew that they were back. He knew that there was somebody there that hadn't been there before. Naomi and Ruth were back, but yet he had never seen him. And so when we look at our text, it goes this way. Then Boaz said to his young man, who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is a young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. There's two things that could slip by real easy that happened there. One was that she didn't just go and work on her own. She asked permission. Secondly, she didn't quit. She was not a flower that melted very soon in whatever heat that they had, but she kept working at it and working at it until that very time when she had taken a break. And so when Boaz saw her, he knew some of the situation. He also knew that she was, as he said it, a young woman. And as Carla said, and I think that's probably correct, a very beautiful young woman. And so it was all of a sudden things coming together. Now you might say, well, it's sort of like somebody wrote this, that it really didn't happen. But some of the things that we could never, ever possibly imagine happening, we wouldn't even write them that if we were writing a story. They do happen. And I believe this is a true story, and I believe indeed it shows this powerful thing that happened between two people that loved each other and loved their God. And so when we go back now to Moab, back to where the women were gathered together, back to where there was no hope at that particular time, there was this woman, this strong woman, who wanted her daughter-in-laws to have a life, who loved them, and who said, go back to your people. Go back where you can marry someone and have a life and have children. He said, because there's no way that we can follow what is supposed to happen, and that is, what is supposed to happen in their culture is that these widowed daughter-in-laws should marry the son, the next son of the family, the next son. And so there was no son. And she said, even if there was a son, you'd have to wait 20 years or so before he would be old enough, and by that time it would be too late. So go home. Go home to your family. But at that particular time, God worked this miracle in a heart, this faith in the heart of Ruth. And Ruth says to her, do not urge me to leave you or return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. What could possibly bring this type of attachment, this type of love, this type of commitment to a mother-in-law? We don't know the whole story. We're only told shortly, a brief synopsis of it. But we certainly are told that Naomi was a fair person, a person who loved her daughters-in-law. She was grieving, so much so that she called herself Mara, which means bitterness. And so when I think about us who have our life before us, whatever God is granting us, and for some of us it's a long time, for some of us we would relatively call it a short time, but God is granting us a special opportunity to do the things that He has planned for us to do, and to do them with courage and faith and strength, as indeed Ruth had, which she received, I believe, also from her mother, and which also she knew and believed in the God, her God, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, the God of Jacob, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And so she said these words, there is no way I am going to leave you. There is no way that I will forsake you. I want to be with you, and I want to be close to your God. Naomi, when coming back to her friends and her relatives, and you wonder perhaps where they would go. Would they go to their house that they had left like 10 or 15 years before? What would you do? But somehow they went back, they saw friends and distant relatives, and they said, could this possibly be? Could this possibly be? And it goes like, Naomi says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Could this possibly be? And why would they ask that? Apparently, she maybe had aged quite a bit, and grieving, maybe she did not look. Maybe she had the whole weight of the world on her face, in her face. And maybe it was because they never expected her to come back. And here she was. Could this possibly be Naomi? And it was Naomi. And Naomi and Ruth settled in. And Ruth decided that she would find a way to provide for her and Naomi. A way to provide. And so she went out and she gleaned. Now, when we think about farm work, and think about what it's like, and so many of us have past roots or parents or connection with farming and with being out in the rural area. And we see in the springtime, the late springtime, early summer, we see the fields, and we don't see too many of that anymore here in Nebraska because what we see is corn and soybeans. We don't see too much wheat or barley. But when I grew up, the farmers in Missouri raised barley, and so barley comes in first before the wheat. And when I grew up, they were using combines and cutting it and bringing in the grain, and it was already pouring out of the trucks. And you could see the pride of the farmers, and also maybe a little trepidation because they didn't know what it was going to cost, how much money they would get. But yet, this was a crop that had been given to them. Their labors had proven worthwhile. And so in this particular scene that we're looking at with Ruth picking up the leftovers, and that's exactly what she was doing. She was picking up the leftovers, and then Boaz spots her. And Boaz asks, "Who is this?" And he is told indeed that it is the daughter-in-law of Naomi, and she is working the field, and she was very comfortable, very, very polite, and so there she is. Then he calls over to her, and he tells her that indeed he wants her to be there. He wants to protect her. He wants her to stay on his land. Apparently, at that particular time, there were sections of land right next to each other. There weren't the neat fields that we have and the sections that we have with the roads dividing up 1 square mile here in Nebraska, but rather they're probably long strips, and so you could easily move from one person's land to another person's land, and he wanted her, Ruth, on his land. He wanted her to be protected. He wanted her to be able to come and eat with his people. He wanted her to be able to drink with his people. He protected her. And this is what happened. In Ruth chapter 2, verses 10 to 12, chapter 2, verses 10 to 12, it says this: "Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, 'Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?' But Boaz answered her, 'All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge.'" Under wings, God's wings, that you have come and that you now have protection. So looking back at where they started from, looking back at what it must have felt like, Naomi and Ruth, to come to this strange land. Not strange for Naomi, but certainly strange for Ruth. Looking at what it meant as far as the leap of courage, the faith that they needed to have, to go against what maybe was common sense, or at least the easy way out, and that was just to give up and stay there. But no, to go back to the homeland, to trust in God, even though Naomi was bitter. But to find indeed that now things were changing. And so Naomi was so excited when Ruth came back and told him about Boaz, because Boaz was a redeemer. And that is something that perhaps you understand already exactly, but what would happen or what could happen would be that Ruth could marry a redeemer, and because of that, then the whole legacy of Naomi would return. The opportunity would return. And so this was a possibility. And so then she said, what you need to do now is to go to this man, to Boaz, to where the threshing site is at, and to wait until he has eaten and drank wine and lays down, and then you need to go and be beside him. Rather a drastic move. Rather a drastic move. Now you got to remember that Boaz had shown love and care and concern. He loved very much, I believe, this individual, Ruth. But this then was the plan, and so how did this turn out? And we read, and when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet, and he said, "Who are you?" The second time. Who is this young woman that's out in the field? It was earlier. And now he says, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Another translation is, "Cover me with your cloak." But in real, as far as being covered, but figuratively, it was the wings of a redeemer, as Boaz had earlier been identified. As he had said, when you came here, you came to this God under his redeeming arms, his redeeming wings. Boaz responded favorably, but he knew that there was even a closer male relative, and so he said, I have to negotiate with him first. Now this is interesting. He offered the opportunity to buy the land that would have gone to Ruth, buy this land to this man, and this man said, I'll buy it. I'll buy it. And then he told him the rest of the story. If you buy it, then you will also have to marry Ruth. And that then created some real problems as far as this other gentleman's ability to will his land to his family. It wasn't a good deal. And so he relinquished his opportunity to buy the land and to marry Ruth, to do what God had chosen and what God was leading, and that was then for Boaz to take Ruth as his wife. My question is, who of these characters, Naomi, Ruth, Boaz, was blessed the most? Well, we can say Boaz, certainly his life was changed. Now, we don't know all of the details about Boaz, except that he was eligible. Perhaps didn't have any descendants or any children. We don't know that for sure. But what we know is that he saw Ruth in the field and said, who is that? At his feet, he didn't toss her away, say, get away, but he indeed spread his wings over her. So yes, we could say Boaz really was blessed in a beautiful, wonderful way, and perhaps was the greatest, and we could argue that he received the greatest blessing. And then there is Naomi. Well, her life was totally changed because she no longer was bitter, but as we see in another part of this chapter 4, we see this. And listen to this. Then the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life, a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Now, this is very interesting. I think maybe grandparents have this sort of in their blood. But look at this. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And then women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. Can I tell you a little story without distracting you? my grandmother, Emma, in Emma, Missouri. My grandmother, Emma, lived in our house. Because at that particular time, with the bank crash, they joined two families together, my grandmother's house and my parents' house. They bought a big house together. So she lived with us, and there was a lot of children. And then there was my older brother, Gene, and my sister, Lois, and then I came along after two other children had died. I came along, and so there was Larry, and then Bob, and then there was Dennis, 2 years apart. And my grandmother took well care of us, and she wrote very nice little diary notes. And so when I was born, she said, Larry is born. And when Bob was born, she said, Bob is born. And when Dennis was born, she said, my Dennis is born. As if it was hers totally. And I'm not sure exactly what changed in her mind, but the preciousness, I guess, of the gift of God at that particular time, as well as the preciousness of what happened here. And in many senses, yes, a son had been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. So, the argument then is, who received the greatest gift or the greatest blessing? Would you say Naomi was better than Boaz? Well, what about Ruth? Ruth was from Moab. Ruth was outside of God's chosen people, except that he chose all, and he was for all. This is an example of how he chose for all. But Ruth had this life that she could have lived back in Moab, and who knows, but here she was blessed, and she was able to marry a man who would take care of her and love her and restore the name of Naomi and restore her name. And so I think, yes, you could argue that this child, as being the child of Ruth, this child who was the grandfather of David, as perhaps you already know. So Obed, don't you love these words, begat? Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David. So he and David then brings this line that brought to us Christ himself. And so I argue that the people, the person that gained the most was not the three that I already have mentioned, but rather it's you and me. You and me. And through this line, through this gift, through this courage and strength of Ruth, who said, I will never leave you or forsake you, your God will be my God, this gift was given then of Jesus Christ. Micah puts it this way, the prophet Micah. But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me the one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. The Messiah would be born from the Ephratites in Bethlehem. Jesus Christ, born in Bethlehem, fulfills the prophecy. So there's many things I think that we can gather from this story. The story of love, the story of devotion, the story of being in God's hand. The story brings home to us that wonderful message, that wonderful understanding that God leads and guides and will direct and will move us and will love us no matter what the dark, difficult Mara situations are. And in Jesus' name,